The reason I want to get on with things is because I know he's waiting. I can see him on the video link. And he's a busy man these days because he's the Minister of Regulation. He's the leader of the ACT Party. He's the Deputy Prime Minister in waiting once they do the handover in a year or a year and a half. He's David Seymour, and he joins us now to discuss a couple of issues. David, firstly, Happy New Year to you. Nice to have you back on the show.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you too, Sean, and everyone loyally following and watching the platform. I hope you've had a great break and back into it for 24.
Well, it has kicked off. Boy, how's it kicked off this week. Look, first, just before we go any further, do you have any comment on what has happened there? And I know that parties are loath to put the boot in when others are down. Less than 6 days after all these allegations come up, Goris Garriman is gone. That would seem to me, actually, and I thought a pretty fulsome apology.
Yeah, well, look, it's pretty sad. And obviously the other thing that's happening is you've now got a person who's been charged and going before the court. So, all the convention there about shouldn't really comment about that. The only thing I would say is that, for small businesses and people running retail, it's been a pretty tough run into Christmas. I visited a lot of shops just going into the Christmas break and just asked, how are you going? There's how many people are coming in and buying stuff, and they're having a tough run. But people forget a lot of retailers are facing a lot of crime, to the point that places like Newmarket and Auckland, Parnell, are basically hiring private security forces now. That's how bad it's got. So I think if anything's been forgotten in all this, it's the amount of pressure that retailers are facing with small, but
we were told yesterday, we were told yesterday, and One News basically picked up on our story, $2.6 billion a year lost in retail crime in this country, which is just phenomenal.
Yep, and that's why this government is starting to reorient the police to being out on the streets, taking on the crime that's affecting people, and in time will increase its capacity to lock people up and have some consequences, because we just swung that pendulum far too far.
Right. Now, I wanted to talk to you about electoral reform, because I think electoral reform is often important to secondary, and I don't like using the word minor, it's very judgmental, to smaller political parties, not the big two. And 150 recommendations came out of this commission that looked into electoral law reform. But it would seem most of them, and the most contentious, I guess, being lowering the voting age to 16, most of them are being rejected by the government, and I presume also by the ACT Party.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's the suggestion of a fourth-year term that we've long supported, and the suggestion that should go to a referendum. I had a bill as a private member last Parliament that wasn't debated, but I hoped it would be. And in our coalition negotiations, we've made sure that that's now one of the things that the three parties are committed to doing, is putting that bill up so that we can finally have a debate. And I think that I think there's about 180 parliaments in the world. Now, not all of them totally democratic, but there's about 180 parliaments in the world. And of them, only 9 have a 3-year term. And I can tell you, as someone who's just got into government, it's a pretty short runway. You're meeting your officials, you're getting organised, you're figuring out what's going to have to happen month by month to get stuff done. And all of a sudden, it seems like it's not long before the next election comes around, because to get a law passed, well, that's basically
one could say that you really only have 2 effective years of being able to do anything, because then you've got a campaign comes up and everything changes and priorities change. What about?
Yeah, and I just take the. Yeah. Sorry, you go.
What about lowering the voting age to 16? And people say it's just fundamentally unfair, as it is now.
Well, it's difficult. It's difficult to see why it's unfair. I mean, it's one of those things. Whether it's driving a car, consenting to medical procedures, gambling. Funnily enough, driving an ambulance is a different age. It's one of the oldest things you have to be. There's an age. And people will sometimes argue that the age should be higher or lower. But even if you agree with that, there's always ages in our society where you're allowed to do things. And then you've got to make the case of why a 16-year-old is the right person to start voting versus an 18-year-old. And there doesn't seem to be any argument for that except for this. And it's an argument that the people who support it don't actually make. If you have 16 and 17-year-olds voting, that's about 120,000 extra people. And it's people who, by and large, do not pay a lot of tax, but do benefit from government services. And I would argue that we already have too many people who pay very little tax, have not paid a lot of tax in the past, and when they go to vote for something, they say, well, you know what, if the government spends more money, it doesn't cost me, but it costs other people. And that basic dynamic, I think, is holding us back. To lower the voting age would significantly increase the number of people eligible to vote.
But if we followed your argument to its logical conclusion, or took it to the extreme, David, you would be saying you can only vote when you reach a certain tax-paying threshold, which, of course, would be outrageous, wouldn't it?
Well, sure, but I mean, we're not taking it to its logical conclusion. We're trying to find
why bother with the argument at all?
Well, I think one of the reasons why people want to see it lowered is that it would shift the overall voting population to people who are more likely to vote for government to spend more money because they make a smaller contribution to how much money the government has to spend through their taxes. I just make that point that is one of the marginal effects. You don't have to take it to the extreme to accept that argument.
Yeah, okay. The other thing that some have said, I'm not sure if you have, is that at that age, under our current education settings, a lot of young people who would be eligible to vote are being propagandised by our state education system to being leftist.
Look, I think that's true, and that's one reason why in our coalition agreement we've got a commitment to reform the New Zealand History's curriculum, which has just been written as a totally Marxist document. It's based on the principles that everything in New Zealand is about colonisation, that everything in New Zealand history is about the exercise of power. There's nothing about entrepreneurship and creativity in the arts and various social movements that don't relate to race and the treaty. And so when that's the general thrust of what kids are being taught, then I think that does bring in a political bias. I mean, in the case of that history curriculum, it's completely Marxist, concepts that are driving it, and we're going to fix that. But in general, there's a real problem with the way that education is being run. You're not seeing a lot about business and entrepreneurship there, although I've got to give a mention to the Young Enterprise Scheme. I went to the awards of that last year where kids are learning about business, and that is a fantastic initiative, but swimming against the tide.